And I wasn't really sure how to deliver this last line, but
I'm scared already.
it's the honest truth. Keith Carter is the most important Texas photographer. Let's hear it for Keith Carter.
Well, first of all, to all my colleagues out there, Wyatt and Kenny, that's not true, okay? I'll keep this mercifully short. Thank you very much for coming, number one. Number two, walking through here when it was quiet by myself, and if you were in my shoes, you'd probably feel the same way. I'd never seen so many of my pieces from a variety of years or decades in one place, and it was a bit moving in some respects. But here's the thing. I truly can't remember last Tuesday who I met for lunch or what but I can remember every single one of these photographs. I can remember all the circumstances. I can remember the conversations. And it's interesting, that's not my area of expertise, but it's interesting how fulfilling that can be. You know, it's like your unwitting autobiography. The other thing I would like to tell you that, hands down, I would not have the pleasure of standing up here and having the opportunity to speak to you if it had not been for my late wife, Pat. And those of you that knew her know what I'm talking about. And a woman of grace and great intelligence and perseverance, and in many ways, you know, just keeps you focused and that kind of thing. But those of you that have been married a long time, you know that, and that's a good thing. So, and I think the other thing I would like to do, and this is about it, is I'd like to recognize my unsung but 30-year studio assistant, Kathy Spence, who's come up here, and her daughter, who's a university student. Stand up, Kathy. But during the 30 years she's worked with me, she's had 3 children, and they're all growing up. And anyway, it's a good thing, and thank you for coming up. So I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot of things, but I thank you for the bottom of my heart for coming. I know it's hot out there. And the book, come on, if you were me, wouldn't you be pleased? Come on. I mean, to have that opportunity, and the 3 things that really happened, if I look back on it, one that changed everything. One was a meeting and marrying Pat. The second thing was meeting and knowing Horton Foote's work, the playwright from Wharton, Texas, which I'm sure everybody knows. And the third thing was when Bill and Sally Wittliff called me up on the telephone about 20 years ago, and we had a conversation that led to a couple of decades of friendship and has helped my work endure. And I'm from Beaumont. I love all y'all. Thank you.
So Keith and I are just going to talk a little bit, and we'll open it up to a couple of questions, and then later on we'll have a book signing. This whole thing for us here at the Wittliff began, a couple years ago. Bill Wittliff and I, with Carla, talk about what's coming up in the next couple of years that we want to do for exhibitions, major books that we want to put out. And we've also been, as I mentioned, talking about an expansion, and we thought, wouldn't it be great if we kind of celebrated kind of a new beginning for the Wittliff collections as we continue to expand by looking back and celebrating the photographer's work whose work first graced the gallery here at the Wittliff, which is this image right between me and Keith here, Cosmos. And so we thought Keith would be a great way to really celebrate. And with UT Press, who's been a wonderful partner for us over the many years, doing these nice, big 250 illustration books, we just thought it was a perfect way to do it.
Designed by DJ Stout of Pentagram.
But it certainly is something that Bill and I felt was the right thing. I'm speaking for you, Bill. I hope that's okay. At least I felt. I think Bill didn't object. No, he certainly thought that this was the way we should celebrate kind of this time and our place in the history of the collections. Keith, you've already talked a little bit about, seeing this exhibition and remembering so many works. I mean, what's it like? This is the biggest show you've been in of your work. We have about 150 works on the walls. We couldn't get all 250 in the book up on the walls, but just a huge selection. And what were your first thoughts when you walked in here?
Well, most gallery exhibitions are more or less 40 images, something like that, in that ballpark. Number one, what goes through my mind is you don't have those high ceilings, and it's an intimate place.
Yep.
And I think the rooms lend themselves to more intimate work. In my world, the de jour nowadays is as big as you can make them. But most of the things I've done are relatively quiet and to my mind, fairly intimate. And the scale, I thought, looked wonderful in here. And I don't know, it's things you haven't seen for a while. You go through and you look at them in a different context. They resonate in a different way. It's an enduring experience. That's the best I can tell you.
So I want to kind of go back to your early days as a photographer, and most of you all know this if you know Keith's biography. But his mother was a commercial photographer of children, but you were a business major at Lamar, but then. For those of you in the back that didn't hear that. All right, we'll just keep moving here. What happened? I think I've heard you say you borrowed a camera from your mother.
Okay, it's a quick story. I enjoyed my short-lived career, and I graduated with a degree in business, but the last year I was in that, my mother had always been a photographer of children. I never had paid much attention, and that last year, a sculptor named David Cargill had loaned me a Henri Cartier-Bresson book, which in those days, I'm a product of the late 50s and the 60s, was just a riveting book of photographs. Long story short, I asked my mom, we were a single-parent household, could I borrow her camera? And she said, sure, but please be careful. I took the camera, got some black and white film, and I went down to the river. And I photographed a couple of men fishing. And I had them processed at a photo finishing place. And the story's not that interesting. I brought them back, and I showed them to my mom. And my mom, whose name is Jane, or was Jane, said, honey, you have a good eye. I swear to you. And she said, honey, you have a nice sense of light. So I guess the bottom line, it was good parenting, I mean, I thought, I do, huh? And I never have looked back, and that's the true story. I thought, well, it's like breathing air, just looking and making photographs and thinking about the context of the situations and the cultural implications of the situations and the symbols you find in everyday life and things like that. But it started slowly, and a few years later I met Pat. And that upped the flame.
And you've talked about how important it is for photographers often to know the history of their medium, to look at photography.
Oh, yeah. Well, I tell students, look, you stand on the shoulders of giants, men and women who have made some of the world's greatest photographs in a short history, less than 200 years, under the world's worst and most risky complications. Bad water, dangerous chemistry, no books to look at, no colleagues to talk to. You just made them. That's where you come from. You stand on the shoulders of giants. And your best shot, if you're a student, your best shot is to settle down and try and become yourself as best you can, as best you can. And it's a beautiful pathway, and it can't be done immediately. But it can be done quickly because you're in my class, and I'm going to move your ass along. It's not a scholarly thing, but that's what I tell them.
Well, I was going to ask this a little later, but I mean, speaking of your teaching and all the many, many years that you've been doing it, what, if anything, have you learned from the students you teach, the serious photography students that you work with? What?
Well, I'm a completely different generation and much more experienced and much more nuanced. That said, they try things that I would never do. And it's just wonderful. You know, they think in a different way, as they should, in their own generational way. So it's a kind of a mutually symbiotic thing. You learn things from them, and they learn things from me. But the world of art is a great encompassing thing, and it's apolitical, and it should be apolitical, and it's a beautiful thing. It's the thing that gets me, and not to get political, is right now in education, it's the STEM acronym, you know, science, technology, engineering, and math, and they leave out humanities or art. We could make it STEAM. It makes better engineers.
It's hot enough in here, Keith, isn't it? It's already too hot.
Well, that's just my opinion, but I mean, it should be an encompassing thing. That's what's enriching in a culture, period.
You mentioned a little earlier Horton Foote, and so I wanted to talk and ask you, the concept of place and the spirit of place is something that we here at the Wittliff are all about. For our mission to collect, preserve, and share, it's kind of the spirit of the Southwest, and in photography it extends into Mexico. And Horton certainly was about place too. And I certainly have felt over the many, many years of your career that place is something very special in your work and for you. So can you talk about place?
Well, in my formative years, I mistakenly thought in order to make work that somebody would look at or pay attention to, that I needed to go to some exotic locale. And I still have a number of colleagues that do believe that, and to some extent that is true. But when I met Horton, and I had read all those plays, and Pat had been a fan. She's the one that introduced me to the plays. She said, you should really read these. They took place in a fictional small town on the coast, and they had ordinary people in them, you know, and they all faced ordinary trials and tribulations. And sometimes they did it with enduring grace, and sometimes they didn't behave well. And it made me think about what I now call the poetry of the ordinary, where it's not really ordinary at all. And I started to take that idea and photograph. But then I went to something like this. I went to the Galveston Opera House, and Van was there, and it was a Horton Foote Film Festival. And there was a panel discussion. And on that panel discussion were a lot of academics, some of whom I love, who wear elbow patches and all that kind of thing, and have the beards, no offense, and all that kind of thing too. And they were talking about Horton's plays in all these academic terms. And I'm sitting in the audience, and this was a long time ago, 1986. And it became Horton's time to talk. And he had this lovely, mellifluous voice, silver-headed, navy blue jacket, gray slacks, white shirt, regimental tie. And he said, you know, when I was a boy growing up in Wharton, I had a teacher, and I said to him, you know, I think I want to be an artist, and I think I want to be an actor. And I sit up at this point, and he said, and the teacher told me, well, Horton, this is an agricultural community, and that's going to be hard. He said, but you're going to have to know a couple of things. And I sat up a little straighter. And he told me, if you want to be an artist, you have to learn the history of your medium. You have to learn what's come before you, on whose shoulders you stand. And I thought, yeah, okay. And he said, and then you have to be a product of your own times. You have to make your art or write your plays or do your creative work in your own generational way, not like they did it, say, 40 years ago or 100 years ago. And I sat up a little straighter, and I thought, yeah, I sort of know that. And then he said, so I go to the Pasadena Playhouse from Wharton. I go to New York. I work for a few years. He said, and then I learned that wasn't enough for me. He said, then I learned that I had to belong to a place. I had to put down roots somewhere, and my work would spring from that. And he said, my place was that small town I came from. Well, I sat bolt upright like St. Paul struck with light. You know, I thought, holy moly, belong to a place? My little place that's full of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, African-American imagination, Hispanic mythology, Cajun overtones of music, evangelicals, rednecks, peckerwoods, alligators, you know, all these things in a gumbo culture with their religious overtones, musical overtones. I thought, my gosh, why don't I just pay attention to my place in a larger way? And that's when I started to look for things that at first glance were ordinary, but to my eyes were not. That had implied meanings to them, implied narratives, not just a documentary photograph. Here's what I'm describing. Here's what you should think. It was a little more open-ended.
And you've done that starting off, especially I think in East Texas and in the Deep South. But I mean, of course, since then you've gone all over the world and photographed everywhere. How do you bring that place with you?
That's exactly what I tried to do, and I thought about it a lot. I try to take my place with me. If I'm sent or go to some place that theoretically is exotic, who doesn't love Paris? Who doesn't love Prague? You know, et cetera, Venice, et cetera, et cetera. But I try to take my place with me, and if I'm successful most of the time, I try to make photographs that look like they could be made anywhere rather than specifically about that place. If I did it specifically about that place, that's an editorial article or something to be printed educational. I wanted to make things that were more enduring, that were slightly flawed, kind of like the people I know, that gave people credit for intelligence. And it wasn't about how slick I could be, because homie here can be slick if he wants to, okay? But most of the time I just don't want to.
If there's any student reporters out there, that's certainly the line you need to, that's the headline there. I think just another question or two. I think one of the great things, anyone who doesn't even know your work, if they come to this show, they see this exhibition with the span that we have here of your work, you can really see a major shift in your approach to photography. In the early on, you're more straightforward in terms of especially focus, but there's a documentary tradition that you're working with, and then something happens, and it all shifts so much. And maybe Fireflies is the
yes.
image for me that
Yes.
kind of encapsulates that
Well,
very different look.
Yeah. The great mythologist Joseph Campbell said a lot of intelligent things, but one of the things I always loved that I have on my darkroom wall is accidents in your life can often become main plots. And I did a photograph back in 1992 called Fireflies, and it was two little boys in what we call a baygal, which is a body of water near a swamp, not far from where I live. And I saw them there. It was the end of the day, and I went over and I said, "Hey guys, can you hold still? I want to make a photograph of you." You know, it wasn't brilliant or anything like that. Well, they didn't know me and they didn't pay any attention, so they just kept moving. So I made 12 exposures, had my camera on a tripod, and when I developed the film, I was so disappointed. I was crushed because I had hopes for this. It's the end of the day, blah, blah, blah. And I told Pat, and she said, "Well, let me see it." And so she goes out, come out to the dark room. It's 88 paces from our back door to my dark room. And she goes out and she looks and she says, "Well, I think you should print one." I said, "Well, they're not sharp." And she says, "I think you should print one." So I printed it. And she came back out and looked, and she said, "I think you should print that bigger." And I said, "It's out of focus." And she said, "No, it's not all out of focus." So I printed it one more time, and I got it. And it changed everything for me. And I wouldn't have gotten it had she not been who she was, and always worth listening to. But it became probably my signature photograph. All kinds of good things happened because of that, but it started out as a mistake. I was blinders on. I wanted it to be sharp. When it wasn't sharp, and the only thing that's in focus when those little peckerwoods will not hold still, for those of you who know photography, I'm at f2.8, which is no depth of field. I focused on the, out of desperation, the magnolia leaf above their head, because that's symbolic of the Deep South. That worked for me. So I did that, and that's the only thing in focus. But now it became something completely different. It became so open-ended. It wasn't about anybody specific. They had those little skinny bodies that you only have when you're 6 years old, you know, that kind of thing. I'm deconstructing it now, but that's what happened. It was a mistake. But I thought, oh, wait a minute. Sure, sharpness is highly desirable, but it's not the end-all to beat-all, you know. Just something has to be sharp. And that's when I changed things. And every time I've changed things, for those of you that are artists or younger, I've always been scared. I've always been scared. You know, when you have something working, why change it? But I don't know how you grow, you know, if it's the arts, if you don't try. And sometimes even your best friends don't like it, you know, and you have to think about it. But, and it's good to have somebody who will tell you the truth, you know, a colleague, a friend, you know, and discuss those things. But in the end, it's your work. You go forward with your work. But I'm fond of saying, I make raggedy-ass pictures, but I know how to make them perfect. I make them raggedy-ass for a purpose. And there's a different type of endurance and a different type of accessibility, and there's a different type of implied narrative in them. There's a literary wholesomeness sometimes. And they ask more questions in some cases than they do provide answers. That's how I look at it anyway. Y'all mad at me for saying rabbity ass? You know, I speak in the vernacular. I'm fine with it.
I was going to ask, speaking of scared, were you willing to take a couple questions from the rabble out here?
Well, I'm sure you're tired of sitting there and listening to this. How about we have 3 questions? Does anybody have a question? Please.
You mentioned how Pat helped influence in this art, and as the partner to a photographer, I'm wondering what did Pat do that you keep talking about the influence that she had in photography. I'd just like to hear more about that.
Well, briefly, she's so well read, and I'm such a smart woman that I learned quickly to listen. I didn't always agree, but I think it's great to have somebody to bounce an idea off of, particularly if you're not sure where it's going to go. How can you do anything new if you know exactly what it is you're doing? How can you do anything new if you know exactly what it is? And she gave me courage. If she was okay with it, and she was the smartest woman I knew, sometimes I ask Kathy, what do you think? It's a fool to try and work in a vacuum, in my experience, and I've had a lot of experience. So it's good to have somebody you can talk to. You don't always have to agree, but you need to talk. Hank Williams? I can do some Hank Williams. Dennis?
So, for people who have never known Keith as an educator here today, I want to talk about that because there's an intersection between you as a great teacher, a photo educator, and you as an artist that not everybody knows. I'm sure there's some of us that know about that, and I thank you for it. You were my teacher for 5 days over 20 years ago. But I've been so impressed with, I've seen you with young photographers put out the work, are scared to death, and how generous and empathetic you are with them. And I was going to ask you about what you taught, what I heard you talk about in trying to get students to get involved in projects, small projects, and things like that to kind of help get started. But speaking of Pat, how did that first book, how did that, from here to there, book?
From Uncertain to Blue?
Yeah.
Briefly. We were going to celebrate our 10th wedding anniversary, and I was trying to think of something that would please her. And I said, well, let's borrow some money, and the most exotic place I could think of, let's go to New Guinea. Let's go someplace. And she wasn't the least bit interested. And I thought about it, and the next day I said, how about we go to 100 places in this wonderful state that have esoteric names? Because, as she had always pointed out, they were always based on something. Sometimes a family. There was a narrative there. A family, a history, a something. And so that's when you went down to the filling station and got a map. We got out a map, which is in the Wittliff collection. It's out right now. And we circled 100 places one night. We had the best time. And then we spent 3 years. We weren't making any money, but we were having such a good time. We spent 3 years going to all of these little places. And my mandate was to make one photograph, not based on the name of the town. So if it's named Ding Dong, don't make some stupid Ding Dong photograph, And she became, very quickly, she saw that if there's not much going on and you stop and you set up a tripod and it's a crossroad place, you're the most interesting thing there. And people come out to talk to you, or they did in those days. And they would say things like, surveying, huh? And I learned quickly after a period of time, if somebody was out or something, I would always say, these are rural places, I would say, y'all been getting any rain? That's not making fun of, that's just really what would start a conversation, you know, and one thing would lead to another. Do you mind, you have anything in the backyard I could make a photograph of? Could I take a look? Little things like that. So that's what happened. And what happened further on was started filling the box with these pictures. And then when I showed them, the reaction was not what I expected. People really liked them, and they liked the name. Texas Monthly was and is one of the great magazines, and I had done work for them at that time. And I asked if I could, and they had a publishing branch at that time, and I asked if I could show them my pictures. And I was so nervous, I did. They said, why don't you finish this, maybe we'll publish it. They did. That's when I met DJ Stout, and it became the book From Uncertain to Blue, and that changed everything. But it was basically a wedding present. Sappy, huh? Oh, the last thing and the most important thing, if you're a student too, is what it made you do, or it made me do, is force me to make a photograph when there was nothing worth photographing by contemporary or intelligent standards. There's nothing to fix a good photograph. You know, no interesting person out there, no, you know, just dilapidated building. What do? You try everything you can think of to make something out of nothing. And it was the best training I ever had. And then you started to see how things look photographed. That's a completely different context. It's one thing to look at them. It's another thing to see how it looks photographed. So I don't want to get into the philosophy of it. Yes?
Could you speak to how the transition from film to digital affected you and your art, your work as an artist?
Yes. If you look at the history of photography, one process in the 179 years of the history, one process has always replaced another process as it has evolved. The irony is not one of them has disappeared. And there's probably more interest now in the academic world and universities around the world in what we call antiquarian or historic processes, early daguerreotypes, tintypes, all these kinds of things, talbotypes, how the medium in art history evolved. And I think that the evolution to the digital world is a natural evolution. Personally, I work with 19th century equipment sometimes, and I work with a digital camera sometimes. I think they all have their place. The digital world has changed everything to color. That's the default. Everybody gets a color photograph. And most people are disposed to be drawn to color. It's a different type of audience often for black and white, and it's not an either-or thing. It's just the way things are in this world. The bottom line is I think it's made things easier. It's made everybody a photographer. Everybody has a cell phone. Everybody takes photographs. 2.4 billion are uploaded daily to social media, most of them S-H-I-T-T-Y. That's an opinion based on some experience.
I think on that scale and paring down topic, in understanding that you remember every single photograph, how on earth did you pare down to 250? What was the experience like? How did you do it?
Well, you know, how did I pare down my half a century of work into 250 photographs? Essentially, that was a privilege. I just took a look at everything, tried to get it organized, and tried to think back as to what happened when, you know, when things started to change. And what did I think were the best examples? That's A. B, you're not always the best judge. So I think everybody needs an ideal viewer or somebody good or a friend, and it'll tell you the truth. And I have a couple of them in Beaumont. And Pat used to be that one. I would listen. And you get other people's opinions. And so pretty much what you would probably do. And then you live with them a little while. And then I wanted to work with my friend and colleague, DJ Stout, again, because he eats, drinks, and sleeps design. I eat, drink, and sleep. A, education. B, my work. And sometimes those are reversed, depending on the month, that kind of thing. And so I got some other opinions, and then I ultimately made my choices. That's how I did it. Yes?
Keith, how old are you when you think you finally sort of hit your stride, and why do you think it was that age in particular?
Sure. It took me 10 years to earn a living by anybody's standard, but that wasn't a bad thing, and I had a good helpmate and that kind of thing. It took me 20 years to publish a book. In my era, publishing a book was the holy grail. It was a wonderful thing. I still think a book is an extraordinary thing, period. And I will always think that. So it evolved along those lines. And then your photographs change as your interests change and as the technology changes and as you change as a person. And it's when you change as a person and your work changes and your family doesn't quite get what you're doing, or you're not even sure, that's when you put one foot in front of the other and you just keep going. It takes a while. My best friend, the person I always talk to in this room, we don't always agree on what's the best photographs. It just doesn't happen that way. Most of the time we agree. That kind of thing. Yes. Anybody? Well, that's enough.
think that's
How
enough.
about? Huh?
Ladies and gentlemen, Keith Carter.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate that, and apparently you're not mad at me for raggedy ass. Okay.